Today I'll be giving you an update on my February knitting projects and my first machine knitted socks. Hello everyone, welcome. My name is Julia. This is my channel Hella Knits, and today I just wanted to sit down and share with you all the things I've been working on in the month of February. I can start with what I'm wearing. This is the champagne cardigan from Petiteknit. It's a top-down oversized raglan cardigan with a double knit button band and some long 1x1 ribbing on the cuffs and body. I knit this quite a while ago. I honestly don't remember when. It could have been 2023, maybe 2022, but I get so much wear out of this cardigan. I think this is actually the first cardigan that I ever knit. I did it with Drops Flora, held double, as well as one strand of Drops Silk Mohair. And I believe the Flora was in a brown mix and the Silk Mohair was just in brown, but all the details are on my Ravelry. And I wear this sweater all the time, and so the mohair is kind of like matted down, I guess you could say. I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to depill mohair because it gets rid of the furriness. So I've never depilled this, and there are a few pills here on the sleeve, but I'm not too bothered by it. I love this cardigan so much. I think I knit this in the size small. The next time I make one of these, I will definitely go down to a size extra small because it is quite big, but this is a very cozy cardigan. It's just so easy to throw on and goes with everything. The buttons I used are just some plastic brown buttons that I got from Fabricland, nothing special. Why don't I just get right into it and I'll start talking about the things that I've finished since I last spoke to you. So the first thing is my Sophie scarf mod, and I have it right here. I'll talk about the yarn first. The yarn that I knit this in is from Lichen and Lace, which is a Canadian company that does hand-dyed yarn. My friend gave me a ball of their one-ply Superwash Merino and the Marsh Mohair in the color Amethyst for my birthday. To hold with those two, I went to my local yarn store and I got some of their 80/20 sock yarn, also in the color Amethyst. And so I'm holding 3 strands together for the scarf, and I believe I used a 5mm knitting needle. The pattern for the Sophie scarf calls for a 3.5, and I believe the Sophie shawl is a 5. So that's what I used. My gauge wound up being close to like a worsted or an Aran weight gauge. I didn't gauge swatch, I just went ahead and did it. So yes, I held these 3 together and I really loved the way the fabric turned out. It's really drapey, and the mohair is incredibly soft. It's so soft, and I've been wearing it up against my face. The mohair does shed, but I have never experienced a mohair that doesn't shed, so I feel like that's kind of to be expected. The fabric turned out to be this really beautiful tonal purple. So that's the yarn and the fabric. I do have an extra ball of this sock yarn because the meterage for the merino and the mohair was just over 400 meters and the sock yarn was just under 400, so I wound up getting 2 balls of the sock yarn. I did have to break into the second ball to finish the scarf, but I will probably use this to make a pair of socks on my machine, so this will get used. I would absolutely knit with the Lichen and Lace again for another special project that's close to my face and neck, just because it's so soft. I guess now I can talk about the pattern. So the pattern that I used was the Sophie scarf. I do have both the Sophie scarf and the Sophie shawl patterns, and the only difference between the two is the increase rates and the gauge. So the Sophie shawl increases faster and more frequently than the Sophie scarf. So the scarf gives you a much skinnier, more tapered shape, whereas the shawl gets fatter quickly. So the gauge that I use for this is pretty much the gauge for the Sophie shawl, but I followed the increase rate for the Sophie scarf because I wanted to have this really nice long taper that I could tie around my neck and didn't feel too bulky. And also I just wanted to kind of maximize my yarn that I had and the length of the scarf. So I wanted it to be longer rather than wider. For both the Sophie scarf and the Sophie shawl, it tells you to do increases until you meet the halfway point and then immediately start doing decreases. But what I did is I did increases just until I was happy with how wide it was. And for me, that's about like 8 8.5 inches wide. Then I knit flat for quite a while until I got halfway through my balls of yarn based on weight, put a stitch marker, and I basically just repeated what I had just done. So that created kind of like a trapezoid shape rather than a triangle shape, if that makes sense. It's kind of hard to see here because the slope is so gentle, but I have quite a long panel where it's just rectangular with no increases or decreases. I really like the way that looks because then the scarf isn't too wide and I'm able to wrap it around my neck like 2 or 3 times and tie it. Doing this also allowed me to kind of maximize my yarn usage. I don't know how much this weighs, but this is all I have left of these 2 balls of yarn. I'm pretty happy with that. I feel like I would have been a little nervous if I had gone a little further. So this will go in my scrap bucket. Yeah, that's pretty much what I did for the pattern and the modifications. I found that this pattern, although it's simple, it isn't exactly mindless because the increases are so far apart that it is kind of important to keep track of how many rows you've done in between increases. And sometimes, especially with the garter, it can be a little difficult to quickly read your knitting. I definitely missed a few increases and decreases along the way and had to go back, unravel it a few rows and redo it. So definitely be mindful of that. I would say it's a simple pattern, but it's not a mindless pattern entirely. And also this did take quite a while and I felt like it took forever, especially once I got to the middle part that's like the widest part of the scarf. It makes sense that the widest part of the scarf is going to take longer, but it really felt like a slog as I was doing it. But then when you get to the decreases, it goes quite fast. I really do love the finished look though, and it definitely is worth the effort and time because I've worn this so much already. And how I wear it is I wrap it around my head and then around my neck, kind of like the Sophie hood, but there's no shaping for the hood part. I was originally hoping to do a Sophie hood, but I didn't quite have enough yarn to. I think the Sophie hood and the My Jose hood are 2 similar garter hoods that I would love to knit and probably will in the future, but they call for I think 500 or 600 meters of yarn, whereas I only had just over 400, so I didn't want to push it and risk running out of yarn midway through. So I decided to do this sort of scarf modification, and I am so happy with how this turned out. I do think though that if you're comfortable doing I-cord edging and some increases and decreases, you probably don't need to purchase the pattern. It is pretty basic, but that being said, I am happy that I have it and I really do love how this scarf turned out. Give you one more look at the fabric. I do want to say as well, this is quite long, obviously. I think I said in my last video that I wasn't sure exactly how I wanted to block it because it's so long. I didn't honestly even use blocking mats though when it came down to it. I wet it and washed it and then I just laid it flat on the floor and I actually folded it. I folded it once or twice just so it fit in my laundry room because there's only so much floor space in there, and it was fine. It didn't crease or anything, which is what I was kind of worried about. So I don't think there's really a science to blocking one of these. Just lay it in a place where it fits and make the edges somewhat straight and it should be fine. I think that's all I have to say about my Sophie shawl, so I will talk about some socks now. The next finished thing that I want to talk about I actually don't have with me because I gave it away already. I have some pictures I can put on the screen as I'm talking about it, and it is my first ever finished actual socks on my sock machine. I posted a video previously of assembling my sock machine and talking all about it. I hadn't actually made anything with it until this month. It took me a while to kind of optimize how to use it and figure out a general way of constructing a sock on it. I managed to do it and they are functional socks and they looked pretty good. The cylinder that I used was my 60 stitch cylinder. I did do a test swatch tube on my 64 stitch cylinder when I first constructed my machine, and I tried sliding that on my foot and it was a little bit big, so I sized down to my 60 stitch cylinder. There's a little thing on the side of the cylinder on the sock machine where you can adjust your knit tension so you can make your knit stitches tighter or looser. So I made it a little bit tighter. I won't get into too much detail about how exactly I used it because I think I'd like to put up a video of how to use the sock machine separately. I wasn't sure like how many rounds to knit for the foot and the leg of the sock, and I wasn't also sure if I should do it toe up or cuff down. When you knit a sock on a machine, you are essentially going to have to do an afterthought heel, which means you pick up stitches for the heel once you've knit the entire tube, and you kind of knit in the round for a heel and decrease. So I have never done that sock construction before. The only other pair of socks I made were using a slip stitch heel with a heel flap and gusset. So I had no idea like really what I was doing. A lot of the hand knitting sock patterns that I could find online didn't have row counts for the feet and the leg of the sock. It just basically says knit into a certain length based on your foot measurement. When you're knitting on the machine, it is kind of hard to gauge how long your tube is. You have to put weights in the knitting in order to stretch it out and put tension on your work. So it's kind of hard to measure how long it's going to be because it's all stretched out. So all that is to say, I found some very limited patterns online for machine socks, and I just kind of guessed based on what I could see in those. And even with those, they tell you to do a gauge tube and measure your row gauge, and I honestly just didn't feel like doing that. So for these socks, the first one I thought I would do it toe up, and I did 60 rounds for the foot, and I put half of the stitches on hold on a waste yarn for the heel, and then I continued and I did about 55 rounds for the leg, and I cast off. For the second sock, I decided to go cuff down because I had a ton of yarn left over when I knit the first sock, and I just kind of wanted to see how it looked or if it looked any different picking up for the cuff, heel, and toe if you knit the tube cuff down as opposed to toe up. I hope that makes sense. That's what I did for the second sock, but I still used the same row counts. And after I basically had 2 tubes with a piece of waste yarn down the middle for the heel, and so at that point I was able to pick up stitches for the cuff, and I knit a 2x2 ribbed cuff from the right side. On some of my previous videos, I mentioned that my ribbing is actually a lot neater when I do it on the wrong side, and so when I knit these socks, the cuff is a little bit janky looking because I didn't knit it from the wrong side, and in hindsight I should have, but I did both of them the same so that the socks looked even. And then the cast off I did on the cuff was a stretchy cast off. So it's essentially a knit cast off, but instead of just pulling the second stitch over, you knit them both through the back loop. That kind of creates an extra loop of yarn that allows your cast off to be nice and stretchy. But when you do the stretchy cast off, it does kind of flare. But when you have it on your foot, you can't tell because it kind of stretches it out. So it's definitely more comfortable than the other socks that I knit last year by hand that had a regular knitwise cast off. For the heel and the toe, I essentially constructed them the same way. So you pick up stitches in the round. I did it on magic loop for the heel and the toe, and I started decreasing. I did 4 decreases per round, every other round, until I got down to half the amount of stitches, and then I decreased every round until I had about 14 stitches left on my needle, and I Kitchenered them closed. My Kitchener was a little messy because I think I mentioned this before. I prefer to do Kitchener when the work is off the needles because I can better visualize like how the stitches are supposed to lay. When I was doing these socks, I couldn't do that because the stitches are so small and slippery that they just were coming undone. So I had to do the Kitchener with the work on the needles. It turned out a little bit messy, but what I did to fix that is once it was done, I just went back over and duplicate stitched over that Kitchener I'd just done, and that made it look so much better. Okay, so that's a lot about the construction of the sock, but I wanted to just kind of get it out of that's how I did it. They turned out great. Like, I think overall the construction I'm really happy with. They look pretty clean. I am a little bit worried about the heel because the socks that I have currently that I hand knit, they have a slip stitch heel as I mentioned, and that essentially gives it a double layer of fabric over the heel to resist like wearing down and creating holes in the heel as you wear them, whereas the wedge heel and the wedge toe only have one layer of fabric just because it's regular stockinette with decreases. So I'm interested to kind of see how they hold up given that there's only one layer of fabric, but I think it'll be fine. This is a pretty popular way of doing heels and toes, I think. So, I mean, it's been done a million times before. I'm sure it'll be fine, but I am curious to kind of see how they last with the different heel construction. Oh, I should mention that I knit the cuffs, heels, and toes with a 2.25 millimeter needle, and I did it on magic loop. I think I prefer using a 60 to 75 centimeter long circular needle on magic loop when I am knitting socks or if I'm knitting parts of a sock. They were a little bit big for me when I tried them on, so I asked my mom if she was interested in keeping them because she has ever so slightly larger feet than me and she loved them. So they are with her now. I can kind of talk about the yarn quickly. This is the yarn that I used. It is a self-striping yarn and it is, I believe, 75/25 wool polyamide, and it's a Regia sock yarn. I have the ball band here. So it's called Regia 4-ply color. And I believe it's for children because it has these little monsters on it. These came in 50-gram balls. So assuming this is for children, one ball of this would probably be enough to make a child's pair of socks. But because I'm making adult socks, I had got two. The self-striping patterns are kind of shown on the ball band here. So I have the one that's like purple with pink and blue. I think I said it's a 75/25 wool polyamide blend. I got this at Myrtle Station Wool when I was there getting yarn for a different project that I'll talk about in a sec, and I saw their display of Regia yarns, and I have always wanted to try Regia sock yarn because I know they're very popular. I figured that was my opportunity, so this is what I got. I am really happy with how the fabric turned out on these socks. I feel like compared to the other pair of socks that I have, which is a Superwash Merino yarn, these are definitely woollier. Like feeling in the hand, they feel much woollier. But on the feet, it doesn't irritate my skin, and my mom, who has them now, she's not bothered by them at all. I honestly feel like these feel warmer on the feet than my other socks. So I am really happy with this yarn, and I would love to knit with more Regia yarn again. I think it's a really hardy feeling sock yarn. The socks that I knit last year in the Biscotte Superwash Merino, I don't put them in the dryer. I just put them in the washer on a delicate cycle, and I hang them to dry with my other delicates. But my mom actually told me that she ran her socks through the regular cycle and through the dryer, and I saw them afterwards and they looked brand new. So I'm hoping that that continues and they don't wear down by going in the dryer, but their first trip through the washing machine was fine. So I'm happy with how this yarn is behaving, and yeah, I'm really excited to try more Regia yarn. I think the self-striping is so cute, and this is how much I have left over from each of the balls of yarn. I used a separate ball for each sock, and this is quite a lot in my opinion to have left over. I will use this for like heel cuffs and toes for future socks. I did learn my lesson that in the future I should just knit all my socks toe up, because now I know how long I want the foot of my sock to be. And let's say I'm knitting a sock for someone else, I'll just figure out how long I want the foot to be, and then after that I can continue knitting just until I run out of yarn for the leg of the sock, and I won't have nearly as much left over. I noticed between the two socks, I think I mentioned I made these socks, one of them cuff down and one of them toe up, and I was unsure if that would affect the way it looks when I pick up for the heel cuff and toe. It really doesn't. It looks the exact same both ways. So knowing that it doesn't make a difference in how it looks, I definitely will be doing toe up from now on. So yeah, that's my first pair of machine knitted socks. Now, I'm not quite done with sock talk. I have some more socks that I'm working on that I want to show you next. Once I completed my first successful pair of socks on my machine, I wanted to try again and make a pair that actually fit my feet. What I did is I kept on my 60 stitch cylinder and I just tightened the tension a little bit and hoped for the best. I did them both toe up, and I shortened the foot from my last pair of socks by 10 rounds. So instead of 60 rounds for the foot, I did 50. Then I continued working the leg of the sock for just over 60 rounds. I think it was like 61 or 62. And so this is what it looks like. I have both of them here. This is what they look like before I finish them and once I take them off the machine. When I cast it on the machine, this black part here is where the toe would be. I do about 10 rounds of just waste yarn. This is leftover fingering weight yarn from an old project that was just in my leftovers bucket. So I do 10 rounds of waste yarn and then I knit 50 rounds for the foot. And then what I do is, because this is a 60 stitch sock, I put 30 of the stitches on hold with one strand of waste yarn, and this is going to be what I pull out and pick up for the heel. And then I continued knitting for the leg of the sock for another 62 rounds or so, and I did about 10 rounds of waste yarn at the other end. So that's kind of what it looks like when I take it off the machine. And what I did this time is I picked up the stitches for the cuff from the wrong side. So I was able to knit my ribbing from the wrong side, and it turned out so much neater. I also decided to do a 3x1 instead of a 2x2. I honestly don't know why, I just kind of felt like it. And this is how it turned out. You can see the 3x1 ribbing is so clean, and I cast off using that stretchy cast off, but as you can see, when it's just sitting here and like not on my foot, it does flare out quite a bit on the cast off. But once you have it on your leg, you can't tell. So I'm really happy with that. And then what I'm going to do for the heel is I'm going to pick up stitches on the top and the bottom of this waste yarn and then pull the waste yarn out. And I think I will knit decreases at a faster rate this time to make the heel a little bit shallower, and same thing for the toe. So ultimately, hopefully, now that I've decreased the tension on this sock and shortened the heel and the toe, it's gonna fit my foot a lot better. I prefer to have a little bit of negative ease and snugness on my socks rather than having them loose. So yes, I think that is going to be the right way to go. And yeah, this is how they're looking. All I have to do next is knit the heel and the toe. So I'm really excited to see how these turn out. I have tried sliding them on my foot, and it does feel a lot better than the other ones already. So I have high hopes. Also, I wanted to show you, I said I'm knitting the cuff and the heel and toe on a 2.25 millimeter needle again. I'm noticing, I haven't actually measured my gauge on the machine, which I probably should, but I'm noticing that my gauge between the machine knitting and my cuff is definitely different. I hope you can see that the cuff stitches are a little bit looser and bigger than the machine stitches. So I'm really liking the gauge that my machine is giving me compared to what I get by hand. And obviously it's a lot more uniform as well because it's a machine. So really, really pleased with this so far. And they are nice and long as well. I did the leg a little bit longer than the other socks I made last year. So these will hopefully stick out of my boots, and you can see the cute little cuff. Speaking of the cuff, I can talk about the yarn that I'm using. For the cuff, you might recognize this from my last video, knitting everything I knit in 2024. This is left over from the socks I made last year, and it is the Biscotte Superwash Merino sock yarn, I think. Yeah, it's their Bis-Sock base, and it's in the color Morning Dew. I believe this is an 85% merino, 15% nylon sock yarn. This one is the Isager sock yarn in the color Zero Cream, and it's this really nice off-white color. This is a 40% alpaca, 40% wool, 20% nylon sock blend. This is also noticeably woollier than the Superwash Merino is, but because of the alpaca, it has this nice little hairiness to it. I was a little worried that the alpaca would make the socks have like a lack of structure, but really, I don't think it does. These are, ooh, yarn is going everywhere. I was worried the alpaca might give it a little bit too much of a drape, but these do feel nice and woolly and pretty substantial, which I prefer. So I'm really happy with the yarn choice here, and I think the pop of pink is so cute, and I'm glad to finally get rid of the leftovers for that sock yarn because I feel like they've just been lingering around forever. So I've never knit with this Isager yarn before, but I would love to make another pair of socks in it because it is really nice. It's kind of a medium between this Superwash Merino and the woolly Regia yarn. I like all of them, but this is a nice kind of medium woolliness that I feel like anyone would be able to tolerate on their feet. The next thing I have to talk about is my Dagmar zipper sweater. I will talk about the yarn first. I am using the Topsy Farms Pure Sheep Wool in their worsted weight in the color medium gray, and it's this really nice woolly gray brown sort of a mix. It's very woolly. It has a lot of grass and flex in it, and it's very sheepy, but I love it. It's like a perfect, really rustic wool. This yarn is almost the same composition and weight as what's called for in the pattern, but the yarn that's recommended is kind of inaccessible to me here in Canada. So I went with this one, which is a local Ontario sheep farm, and I'm very happy that I did. That is pretty much all I have to say about the yarn. Okay, why don't I just show it to you? This is how she's looking. The Dagmar sweater is a top-down drop shoulder, all over cable texture sweater with a quarter zip and a high neck, and it's supposed to be quite oversized. I originally was planning on knitting this in the size small, but I changed my mind right after I cast it on, and I've been knitting the size extra small, and I'm so glad that I did because this is pretty oversized for me right now, and as I wash it, I know it's going to get bigger, so if I knit the small, I think I would have just been drowning in it. Like, I want it to look oversized, and I think it will, but I think it would have been way too big if I did the small. So I'm very happy with my size choice here. I mentioned in my previous video talking about this that I was having some issues with the tension as I was doing these cable motifs. I find this is an issue that I normally have with cables. I feel like this is common with a lot of people. As I go from knit stitch into purl stitch on this cable motif in particular, I found my stitches looked really loose and gapey, and I wasn't happy with how it turned out. At first, I tried just pulling my yarn and tensioning it as I was going from knit to purl, knowing that it was going to be loose, but I feel like that wasn't really effective in fixing the problem. So what I wound up doing is I started knitting the purl and wrapping the yarn the wrong way around. So what that means is the purl stitch is actually twisted, but then on this next round, I just untwist it by purling it through the back, if that made sense. I think doing that, it uses less yarn as you go from knit into purl than it would if you wrapped the yarn the right way around. So far, I have had pretty good success doing this. Let me see if I can find you an example of where it was kind of looking not so great. You can see here, this knit stitch is pretty loose looking, and I mean, if you're looking at it from far away, you can't really tell, but to me, when I was kind of staring at it very closely and inspecting it, it was bothering me. So wrapping the yarn the wrong way around when I'm doing that purl stitch actually has helped a lot. And I think these cable motifs on the side are looking pretty good and even. So that was the fix that I did for that. At this point, I have knit a few inches past the armhole, and I wanted to discuss some of the mistakes and things you should learn from me if you're going to knit this, because I have made several mistakes in knitting this sweater so far. I found that once you connect in the round for the body, it's a lot more mindful and requires more attention than it does when you're just knitting the front and back, because knitting the front and back is flat. So all the right side rows have cables and all the wrong side rows do not have cables. Now that I'm in the round, I have to focus and make sure I'm paying attention to which rounds have cables and which rounds don't, because it's all on the right side now. So it can be very easy to do 2 rows with cables and then have too many cables. I've had to unravel several times to fix that sort of mistake. Something else I had done was not pay attention and accidentally picked up 2 stitches on this back honeycomb panel towards the bottom here. I was doing a cable round and I noticed, I was like, this is not adding up. I have too many stitches. At that point, I had made several mistakes and I thought, I'm sick of unraveling my work. What I did in that situation was I just did a decrease and hid it in the cables that kind of go behind instead of the ones that go in front. I don't even remember which side of the honeycomb the mistake was on. It was on either this side or this side. Let me know if you can see it. I honestly don't know if I can. So thankfully that was a little fake it till you make it situation, and I managed to fix my error. The last mistake that I made on this sweater was a cable that's the wrong way. I know, on the front too, which is kind of unfortunate. I don't know if you can see here, these cables are going opposite directions. So I realized this once I had already connected in the round for the body, and it was several inches after I had made the mistake. I sat there contemplating whether I wanted to unravel the whole thing or just kind of unravel this section back and re-knit it with like a crochet hook or something. At the end of the day, I decided that I don't care, because I just don't feel like doing all of that work. If you're just glancing at this sweater, I don't think you can tell that the cable is going the wrong way. Like, obviously I can tell, and people who knit may be able to tell, but I showed this to my boyfriend and some of my classmates, and I was like, can you show me where I made a mistake? And they could not tell that the cable was the wrong way. It wasn't until I pointed it out to them that they could tell the cable was the wrong way. So I'm going to just leave it. Those are all the mistakes that I made so far in this Dagmar zipper sweater. I caution you to just pay attention to what you're doing. I feel like a lot of the mistakes I made could have been avoided if I was just paying more attention, but I got ahead of myself. That is the consequence. So be warned, just pay attention. At the end of the day, I am really pleased with how this is turning out though. The one thing I will say though that I'm happy I did for this pattern is create a new chart. The pattern has individual charts for this cable motif, the center one, and the side one, and they're actually different lengths. The chart for the honeycomb cables is like 4 or 6 rows, and then the chart for the side cables is like almost 20 rows. And so I'm having to repeat the honeycomb chart several times as I get through just one of the side cable charts. So what I did when I first started this pattern was I just screenshotted the charts and I copied and duplicated them, all 3 of them next to each other on one sheet. So now I have a chart that uses all 3 of these in one continuous row, and it's very long. As I'm going through the pattern, I'm highlighting across all 3 of the charts at once. It's made my life so much easier. Like, I don't think I would be able to do this pattern if I had not done that. If you're planning on knitting any of the Dagmar sweater, zipper sweater, or jacket, I would highly recommend doing that because you're gonna save yourself a ton of grief. And also paying attention to the pattern helps as well, unlike me. Yeah, overall, I'm really pleased. I'm kind of chugging along with this. It's going to be an oversized sweater, so I want to make it long. I don't really want to crop it too much. I do still have quite a bit to go on the body. It's one of those things I'm just picking up and knitting a few rounds when I can, and it's definitely coming together really nicely. The next thing I wanted to talk about is my Braidy loop sweater. This is a top-down saddle shoulder crew neck sweater with a cable motif that runs up the arm and across the back. The rest of the sleeves and the body have this really wide ribbing. The yarn that I'm using is Gepard Garn Wild and Soft, which is a 60/40 merino silk blend in the color 612. I'm holding it with one strand of the Isager silk mohair in the color 12. The silk mohair is a 75/25 mohair silk blend. I feel like these colors go so well together. The Sophie shawl is the first thing that I've made for myself that's purple. I really love that color on me, so I thought, why not do a purple garment as well? So that is the yarn. It's creating a fabric that's so soft and has a really nice drape. I will show you what I've done so far. So this pattern construction is actually really interesting, and it's like nothing I've done before, honestly. You cast on here in the center with a provisional cast on, and then you do increases out from the center to shape the saddle part of the shoulder. So essentially that starts at the back neck, and then you increase along one side to create the top of the shoulder, and then increase along the other side. Then you pick up stitches all the way around the sides, back and front of each shoulder, and that is what creates your yoke. So you work increases after you pick up those stitches until you get down to split for the sleeves. The yarn that's recommended in the pattern is Knitting for Olive Merino, held with a strand of silk mohair, I believe, and it gives you a 22 stitch gauge on 4mm needles. I gauge swatched with the yarns that I'm using on a 4mm needle, and I honestly found the fabric to be like really holy and open, and I wanted it to be tighter and more substantial. I know some people like the look of like the gauzy, more open gauge. I kind of wanted the sweater to feel like more substantial and that I didn't have to wear an undershirt with it. So what I actually wound up doing is sizing down to a 3mm needle, and that still gave me a 22 stitch gauge, but it gave me a fabric that I'm a lot happier with. You can see it's more you can see the light through it for sure, but it's not like see-through. And I think it just has a lot better heft to it. But that means that my row gauge was actually off. So my stitch gauge was 22, but once I had done the top of the first shoulder, the pattern tells you how long it should be from the center out to the side. And mine was like 4 or 5 centimeters shorter than what it was supposed to be. What I decided to do is just do one extra cable repeat on the shoulder before I picked up back at the center to knit the second shoulder. And that got me to a length that was closer to what was called for in the pattern for my size. And oh, my size, by the way, I'm knitting a size 1. And I'm really glad that I did that, because once I finished the shoulder saddle, I could kind of hold it up against myself, and it does feel like it's wide enough to sit nicely on my shoulders. Whereas if I didn't do that extra cable, I think it would have been too small and too narrow on my shoulders. So that's what I did kind of to modify it just based on my gauge. I never really measure row gauge, to be honest, so I'm glad there was some measurements on the pattern to tell you how wide the shoulder should be. The other thing that I had to do because of my row gauge and because I did that extra cable repeat is once I went to pick up the stitches around the saddle here, I had to modify how I picked them up to account for the extra stitches that I had. So I had to skip more stitches than what the pattern called for as I was picking these up. It took me like 2 or 3 tries to get it right because it was such a large stitch count and it didn't divide evenly. So I basically just had to try it a few times, pick them up evenly so it didn't look too puckered. And I think I managed to do that pretty well. So you can see the pickup seam here is not too tight or cinched in looking. Now I can just follow the pattern and adjust the length of the body and sleeves as I need to based on how it's fitting me and when I try it on. So yeah, I'm really happy with how the fabric is turning out. It's pretty lightweight, I would say, for sure, because the gauge is fine. This sweater is going to be really nice for spring, I feel like, because it's not too heavy and the color is obviously very spring. I've never made anything from other loops, so this is my first time seeing sort of how she writes her patterns and goes about explaining things. Up until I started the increases for the yoke of the sweater, everything was super clear, but the first few rounds doing increases on the yoke were honestly kind of confusing. I think it's just because the pattern explains everything so detailed that it's borderline too detailed and then it becomes confusing. I feel like it could have been written in a way that was a lot more concise, and it's not really that way. The first few rounds when I was doing the increases, I wasn't able to easily read my knitting. I had to really pay attention to the pattern, and I took a highlighter and I would literally highlight sections of each row as I did it between each of these stitch markers. I have a few around to mark where the increases are. I literally would go section by section and mark things off for myself so I didn't get lost in what I was doing. As you can see here, there's a little seam where I've done some increases, and here again you can see a seam where I've done some increases. Now that I can see where my increases are, it's easier for me to just look at it and say, okay, now I have to do an increase. But for some reason, the way the pattern was written just did not jive with me at all. I felt like it was just a little bit too much information. Other than that though, the pattern is well written. I think as I get further along in the pattern, I'll kind of understand the way she explains things. But yeah, that was something that I did struggle with. It could partly be because I'm not used to knitting a saddle shoulder, but also I do think that it just was very wordy. Her designs are so beautiful. I definitely wouldn't use that as an excuse not to knit another one of them because I would love to. And I'm really loving the way this is turning out, especially the way the cables look. And what I do actually when I knit cables for any sweater is I put a little locking stitch marker on the stitch where I did my last cable. So I can just count the knits and determine how many rows I've done since my last cable to kind of help me keep track of when I should be cabling again. So yeah, I think that's all I really have to say about it. I am really happy with how this is turning out. Now that I've gotten some progress on it and created some shape, I feel like I have a little more motivation to work on it, but I have another very woolly wintry knit that I'm a little more excited about working on right now just because it's been so cold out. So this one might not have a ton of momentum until the spring season. That being said, I wanted to share this and share all the progress that I've made because this is quite a lot. The final sweater I have to show you is very exciting. It is the use that I found found for my Knitting for All of Heavy Merino that I frogged from my road sweater a month or so ago. I got a while ago a sweater quantity of Knitting for All of Heavy Merino in the color Coal, which is this black color. I started knitting the Rhodes sweater from Ozetta, which is a top-down drop shoulder high neck sweater in like a worsted weight gauge. I just felt like I wasn't excited about it. I decided I was gonna frog it. After that, I was just unsure of what to do with this sweater quantity of yarn. I was browsing on Ravelry. I was really inspired by different colorwork yoke sweaters. I was thinking at first a low contrast sweater would be really nice, but I saw the Selene sweater from Ann Wenzel. Her sample is a very high contrast black and white colorway, and it has this really bold zigzag colorwork yoke. I just thought it was so striking and different. It's something that is totally different than anything I would wear, but I just thought it would be so fun to make. Why not try something new? So I decided I was gonna go with that pattern, but the gauge on that is actually 20 stitches. This yarn gives me an 18 stitch gauge, so that was not going to work. Ann Wenzel has another version of the Selene sweater called the Super Selene, which has a 19 or 18 stitch gauge. It uses a worsted with a strand of mohair held together. I decided I was gonna go with that. I went to the Myrtle Station wool shop and I picked up some yarn. I got an off-white color worsted weight yarn to go with the black Knitting for Olive. This is the Cascade 220, which is a worsted weight. It's in the color 8505. It's pretty white. It's like a neutral cream white color. And these are essentially the exact colors that she uses in her sample. To hold with it, I got the Sandnesgarn Tin Silk Mohair in their black color, which is color number 1099. And this is a mohair silk and wool blend, so it's not as hairy and it's a little more fluffy than just a mohair and silk. I'm holding one strand of the heavy merino with one strand of the tin silk mohair for the main color of this sweater, and then I'm holding one strand of the white tin silk mohair with one strand of the white Cascade 220 for the contrast color. The white tin silk mohair is the color 1012. Altogether, this is what I'm using for the sweater. I am so happy with how the contrast of these two colors is coming out. I also really like the tone of this white color. I feel like some white yarn can come off a little yellowy looking. I don't really like that sort of tone of white on my complexion. So this is a really nice neutral tone to go with the black, and I think it just pairs so perfectly. I honestly really love Cascade 220 yarn. It's like the quintessential wool yarn. I don't think this is merino. No, this is Peruvian Highland wool actually. It's non-superwash and it feels essentially the same as Knitting for All of Heavy Merino, and it's a fraction of the price. So I honestly would recommend this over the heavy merino, and they have such a better color selection. Like, they have every single color you could possibly imagine in the Cascade 220. I really love this yarn. I love working with it. I'm only using this because I had it already and I wanted to try it. In the future, I think I would just go with the Cascade. The Tin Silk Mohair in the white color is definitely less soft than the Tin Silk Mohair in the black. I have used this yarn once before in my sweater number 23 in their pink colorway, and that was also kind of scratchy. This yarn can be scratchy depending on the color. It could just be the way that they dye it and bleach it and that sort of thing. It's not the softest mohair ever. The wool content in it does make it a little less prickly feeling than the drops, for example. The fabric is quite nice though. I will show you what I have so far. This is what I have so far. The Super Selene sweater is a top-down circular colorwork yoke sweater, and it has a high neck. The edges of the sweaters are knit in twisted rib. It has this really bold colorwork yoke, and then the rest of the body and sleeves is just plain black. It is quite oversized, and the pattern actually has two options. So it has one that's like a full-length version and one that's a cropped version. I am knitting the cropped version because I normally crop things anyway. I'm knitting the size 1. I did not gauge swatch for this. I probably should have, but I just wanted to get started. I had gauge swatched so many times with the heavy merino on different needle sizes. I was honestly sick of it. So I just went with my measurements that gave me the size 1. on. Once I've gotten this far though, I have quite a bit of the yoke done, and I've tried this on and it fits pretty well. So I think once I block it, it's gonna be perfect. I'm going to pretty much knit it to pattern, although I might do some decreases on the sleeves. The sleeves in the pattern are really wide and billowy, and I think I would rather have them a little narrower just so they don't get caught on things or get dirty. Other than that though, I think I'm just gonna follow it exactly to pattern because I really like the way that the sample looks in the cropped version. The pattern calls for, I think, 12 centimeters of ribbing on the neck, and I only knit 5 or 6. It also calls for an Italian cast on, but I did a tubular cast on, and I'm really happy with how it turned out here. Like, I don't know if you can see in the black yarn, but it is pretty continuous and it looks pretty clean. It's also not too tight around my neck, which is very nice. And I think once the sweater is completed and the weight of the sweater and sleeves kind of pulls the neck down, it's gonna be a really nice, snug, crew neck looking neckline, which is what I wanted. The pattern is really well written. This is the first Anne Wenzel pattern that I've ever made. She explains everything so well. The chart on the colorwork yoke is even labeled and tells you which strand is supposed to be the dominant strand and which one is the non-dominant strand for every section of the colorwork chart, which is very helpful. And I honestly think it's really important for this pattern because the dominant color when you're doing two color work is the one that kind of pops and is a little more clean and sharp looking. You definitely want that sort of clean, sharp look on this motif, especially because it's got those angles and zigzags. I have unfortunately had to unravel a couple rounds here and there because I was holding the wrong strand in front, but that's an issue with me, not an issue with the pattern. I just wasn't paying attention. This is going by a little slower than I would like, or maybe it just feels like it to me because I'm used to knitting with the yarn in my left hand, which I think is called continental style knitting. So I don't have to lift the yarn and wrap it around the needle. I can knit that way, and that's how I learned how to knit, but I prefer knitting continental style because it's faster and more efficient. It's easier on my wrists. But when I'm doing color work, I have a hard time holding both strands of yarn in my left hand because I can't maintain tension on both of them evenly, and it winds up looking funny. For this sweater, I've been knitting two-handed color work, which means one strand, which is the dominant strand, is knitting continental, and the other strand, which is the non-dominant, is knitting English style or throwing the yarn over. All that means is that this takes me forever. I feel like it is just going by so slowly because it's just a lot of coordination between both of my hands. Catching my floats too is a lot more work when I have to let go of both strands of yarn, wrap one around the other. I just feel like it's very tedious. Also, I've never knit color work with two strands of yarn for each color, and that is so much yarn management. I'm honestly blown away by how many times I've tangled my mohair. At some points, I just had to cut my mohair and untangle the yarn and then reattach it because it was so stuck. So yarn management and just being patient when you're knitting a sweater like this is something that I am learning as I'm going through this. I definitely need to learn to be more patient and be more careful in how I'm storing this work in progress, because if I store it wrong or I'm not careful about separating the two colors when I put it away, the next time I work on it, it is a huge mess. So those are some things that I'm learning slash struggling with getting through this sweater, but it is honestly so worth it because I think this is so fun and it's a learning opportunity for me to practice my color work. The only other color work sweater I've made is the Celeste sweater, which I made last year in 2024. I had a lot of issues with my tension because I was trying to knit with the two strands on my left hand together and it gave me a whole bunch of tension issues. So doing two-handed color work is the way to go for me for now. If you have any tips on knitting continental with two color work, please let me know. I would love to learn how to manage my tension and hold both strands in my left hand, but so far I have had very poor luck. Yes, any tips would be much appreciated. That being said, I am almost done the color work section and the yoke of the sweater. I only have a couple more motifs to go. I am excited to get through it, and then I can just whip through the body and sleeves because they're one color in stockinette in the round. I'm really loving the way that this bold yoke is looking. I guess that's all I have to say about the Super Selene. Very happy with it. I would love to knit another Anne Wenzel pattern because it is so well written and really intentional, I feel like, without being too descriptive and confusing. I have a few new things that I wanted to share with you that I've purchased and acquired since the last time I chatted with you. One of which is the yarn for my Super Selene. So I got the Cascade 220 and the Mohair to create that sweater. I also got that sock yarn that I used for my very first machine socks. And while I was at Myrtle Station Wool, I got a couple more balls of sock yarn to make more machine socks. One for my boyfriend and one for his friend who helped me cut the holes in my table for my sock machine. These are also Regia yarns. They're the 4-ply color as well. These ones I guess are for adults. It says Atlantis color, so I'm guessing this is just another line of their 4-ply sock yarn. It's this really beautiful blue, brown, and white colorway. And these are also, I guess they're kind of a self-striping. It gives you a picture of what it looks like when it's all knit up. So it's kind of like a speckly, semi-striped yarn. It's also a 75-25 wool polyamide blend, just like the other one. And it's 210 meters for 50 grams. I got 2 balls of these so I can make 1 pair of adult socks. And the colorway is called 4224. I really liked the blue and the brown. I feel like this is kind of a universal men's sock color, and these would be perfect for Devon's friend who helped me make the sock machine. I got another 2 balls of Regia sock yarn, this time in their Patch Antique color line. I don't know what that means, but it's the 4-ply sock yarn again. This is the same exact composition, but it's in this really fun colorway. So it has some green, blue, and like a plum purple color. This also shows you what it's going to look like. I think it looks so fun. If you can see that, it has like little stripes that are kind of speckled. And that's from these little strands here that have like green and white on them. I think these are so fun. Devon really loved these colors together. I'm going to make him a pair of socks with this. Once I sand down the needle channels on my 72 stitch cylinder, I can make some men's socks, and these will be the first ones I cast on. I think that's all I had to chat with you about today. I have a lot of sweaters that I'm very excited about and just chugging along on. Hopefully I'll finish up those socks soon and can get some men's socks on the needles as soon as I can. If you're interested in more details about anything I'm knitting, you can check out my Ravelry, which is linked down below. It's Hella Knitting. You can see pictures, updates, and all the details and nitty-gritty info about everything I'm making. You can also find me on Instagram at hella.knits, where I share updates and pictures of my knits, things maybe you haven't seen before. Great, thanks so much for sticking around, and I'll see you in my next video.